Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Ethan Tilgan from Sabancı University, and I want to thank you all for joining our webinar titled Sustainable Investing and Investors, which is organized by Center of Excellence in Finance and with the sponsorship of AFFAN. I would like to welcome Professor Laura Starks. She is joining us right now from Austin, Texas. Welcome, Professor Starks.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Us too. Let me offer a couple of introductory words for you, if you don't mind. Laura Starks is the George Kozmetsky Centennial Distinguished University Chair and Professor of Finance at the McCombs School of Business, University of Texas at Austin. And she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on ESG investing, among other things. Her current research also focuses on ESG issues, including climate risk and gender diversity, as well as investor expectations and financial decisions. She has won many awards for her research and teaching, including two recent awards, the 2022 Scandia Research Award on Long-Term Savings and the 2021 Moskowitz Prize. She is the immediate past president of the American Finance Association and has previously served as president of the Society for Financial Studies, Western Finance Association, and Financial Management Association. I could go on for an hour maybe about her accomplishments. Again, thank you for being here. We will have a short question and answer session after the talk. You can type up your questions in the chat box and I will direct them to Professor Starks after her talk is over. Thank you again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and I just wish I were there in person because I've been to Istanbul several times, and I just think it's a wonderful city.
Thank you.
So what I wanted to talk about today was climate regulatory risk in corporate bonds, and this is primarily based on some research I've been doing with Lee Seltzer, who is at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Qifei Zhu, who is on the faculty of Nanyang Business School, NTU, in Singapore. So the motivation for this work is that climate risk is increasing and investors and policymakers care about climate risk. And I just wanted to show some evidence, which I'm sure you don't have to be shown, but you know, we have increasing carbon in the atmosphere. This shows the amount, the global monthly mean of carbon in the atmosphere from 1980 to 2022. And as you can see, it's just been steadily increasing over time. And the problem is relatively recent because for thousands of years before today, this graph shows starting 800,000 years ago that there was fluctuation in atmospheric carbon, but it wasn't until 1950 that it started shooting up as it has today. And this has also led to increasing temperatures. If you look at this chart, which is from Professor Ed Hawkins' website called Show Your Stripes, the blue is cold temperatures, and the red, you can see the increasingly hot temperatures. And this is leading to climate risk for companies and for their investors. And if we look at Google Trends and we look over the time period 2004, which is the earliest they have until like a few days ago, you do this search for climate risk worldwide. You're looking at, you know, how many people have been searching for climate risk worldwide. You can see again, there has been this big increase in interest in climate risk. And, you know, does climate risk matter to investors? Well, we can look at climate expectations from investors. I did a survey a few years ago with colleagues Philip Kruger and Zach Sautner of institutional investors and how they thought about climate risk. And one of the questions we asked was, how much will temperatures rise by the end of the century? And it shows, this graph shows it by region, where on the whole left-hand side is worldwide, and then next to that is North America, and then continental Europe, and then the United Kingdom, which included Ireland in there, and then the rest of the world. And so what you can see, particularly looking at worldwide, is that there are very few that say it won't rise at all. And what's even more striking is that 4 in 10 expect a rise that exceeds the Paris target, since the Paris Agreement target was 2 degrees, although the preference is 1.5 degrees. You can see that many believe it will be over 3 degrees. There are also predictions on the cost of climate risk. The Carbon Disclosure Project has predicted that the world's biggest companies face $1 trillion in climate change risk. Later, they came up with a prediction, along with the University of College London, that climate change cost will reach $31 trillion a year if emissions are not urgently reduced. And then the U.S. White House came out with a prediction last year that the federal government could spend between an additional $25 billion to $128 billion annually due to just 6 climate-related financial risks. And federal revenues could be 7.1% lower annually by 2100, about $2 trillion in today's terms. And that's just one country. If you think about the rest of the world, it's going to be very expensive. Now, one caveat about these estimates: they're based on future expectations as of the time they were made, and there exists a lot of uncertainty regarding what could happen and what kind of mitigations could occur. So, what are the challenges and issues with climate risk for investors? Well, if you think about it, climate risk is an environmental, a social, and a governance risk for investors. And what we still need to understand for given investors is how much is due to financial concerns from a value perspective and how much is non-pecuniary based on the investor's tastes and preferences from a values perspective. So if we think about investors, we have 2 types of investors when we're talking about ESG. And also climate risk. We have those that are very concerned about the financial, so I call those value investors, and then those that are very concerned about what's going to happen to our environment or our communities, and that's from a values perspective. So in the survey that I was speaking about before, we surveyed 439 large institutional investors across the world, and they were asked about their motivations for incorporating climate risk into their investment decisions. And these are the top motivations by percentage for incorporating climate risk into investment decisions. Protects our reputation is 30%, is a moral ethical obligation, 28% said that. And I should say these are not mutually exclusive. 27% said is a legal obligation, fiduciary duty. 25% said it's beneficial to investment returns. 24% said it reduces overall portfolio risk. 23% said it reflects asset owners' preferences, and 21% said it reduces tail risk. So if we look, these 3 where I put the arrows, these would all come from value considerations. It's beneficial to investment returns, and it affects portfolio risk. It can lower portfolio risk if you incorporate climate risk into your investment decision. 2 of them appear to be values considerations. It's a moral ethical obligation, and it reflects asset owners' preferences. And then the other 2, protects our reputation and is a legal obligation, fiduciary duty, is a blend. It could be both value and values. So we have this list of the ways in which institutional investors incorporate their climate risk into their investment decisions in terms of how they think about why they should do so. So beyond climate risk being an ESG risk for investors, it's also very difficult to price and hedge due to its systematic nature, a lack of sufficient disclosure by portfolio firms, difficulty in finding suitable hedging instruments. I mean, if you think about climate risk, it's a long-term risk, and most hedging instruments, if we can find one, tend to be short-term. So again, it's very difficult to hedge it and then also to price what that hedge would be. Climate risk has become a first-order topic for policymakers, so that increases the regulatory risk component and requires consideration of its time-varying nature. Climate risk is usually considered in light of its negative effects on asset values, which is really what I'm going to be talking about today, but it can also provide return opportunities. So just some further issues with climate risk. There are different types of climate risk. If we think about it, there's the physical risk, so the risk from gradually increasing temperatures, and then the risk from extreme weather events. There are transitional risk, the policy, the regulatory risk from transition, liability, and then technological. Can you keep up with what needs to be done? There are also reputational risk. And then we have both systematic and company-specific risks that needs to be considered when looking at climate risk. Again, as I talked about the time horizon, it can be very long. And so how to consider what time horizon is important. The other issue is this idea of risk versus uncertainty. With risk, we can estimate some probabilities of what's happening. With uncertainty, we don't know enough to estimate the probabilities. And so climate risk has both. There's a lot of uncertainty that has to do with climate risk. And then, so today I'm going to focus on the regulatory transitional risk. So another thing we asked these investors was how they rated the financial materiality of climate risk, and we gave them a choice from 1 to 5. And I should say that this survey was 2018, so it's, I think if we did it today, it would even be higher. But we found that the regulatory risk and the technological risk for investors, both of these are part of transition risk, ranked a little higher than did the physical risk. And for many companies, they don't face the physical risk as much as the regulatory and technological risk. So another thing we asked them was the horizon for the different types of climate risk: regulatory, physical, and technological. And the left-hand side is regulatory risk. And then the next one is physical risk. And then we have technological risk. And if you look at what the responses were, again, given that this survey happened more than 2 years ago, by now at least 75% should believe regulatory climate risk are already materializing. So, what we wanted to do in our paper and our research was to look at how investors are treating the regulatory climate risk. There's lots of related research. There's more and more happening all the time. And in fact, Peter Tufano and Matteo Gasparini did a survey recently, a couple of months ago, looking at all of the papers on climate finance, and they found over 500 papers, and most of those papers have been written since 2017. So our research question is, do climate and other environmental risk affect corporate bond risk and pricing, particularly through the regulatory risk channel? And our expectation is that climate risk would be borne by corporate bond issuers and investors, and particularly through the risk of regulatory enforcement. So you might ask, well, why corporate bonds? Why are you looking at corporate bonds and not looking at the stock market or equity? Well, for corporations that are raising funds in financial markets, the bond market, rather than the equity market, is the marginal source of finance. They're going to the bond market much more often than they're going to the equity market to raise money. And then in addition, for most firms, climate and environmental risk are fundamentally downside risk. And bonds are more affected by downside risk. In fact, there's a study that found in the cross section, looking across different companies, that downside risk has been shown to be the strongest predictor of future bond returns. So just to go through the major findings quickly, we find that firms with poor environmental profiles, measured as environmental scores or emissions intensity, particularly those firms that are located in states with stricter environmental regulations, they tend to have lower credit ratings. So this is just a descriptive analysis of the relationship between firms with poor environmental profiles and their credit ratings. We also find that firms with poor environmental profiles, again measured as environmental scores or emissions intensity, tend to have higher yield spreads, which would go with the credit ratings. And this is especially for those located in states with stricter regulations. We also look at what happened after the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement meant, and I'm going to talk more about this, but the Paris Agreement meant that countries were going to have to start instituting more regulations in order to lower their emissions. And so what we find that the bond issuers more exposed to climate risk, their credit ratings decrease by about 0.6 of a notch relative to other issuers. And their credit ratings, again, for these bond issuers that have high carbon emissions, decreased by about 0.5 notch relative to other issuers. We look at the bond yield spread, which if your credit rating is lower, you're going to have to pay more on your bonds. And we find then accordingly, the bond yield spreads increased by an average of 42 basis points for firms with low environmental scores and an average of 37 basis points for the firms that had high carbon emissions relative to other bond issuers. We also look at what happened after the Paris Agreement, and we found that in terms of being in states with stricter regulation, and we found that our results on what happened after the Paris Agreement were driven by the firms that were located in states with stricter regulation. We also found that the composition of the institutional investor bond ownership base changes after the Paris Agreement. Some types of institutional investors were selling and some types were buying. And I will go through that in just a little bit. Then you might ask, well, do the findings reverse later? Because in the United States, there was a presidential election in 2016 of a president that had said he would pull out of the Paris Agreement, which the U.S. had previously joined. And we do find that at the election of this president, the top emission industry issuers bond spreads decrease. And then when the actual withdrawal announcement occurred, the bond ratings increase. So we did find some reversal, which again, I will talk about more later. Okay, so the data that we use, we have different measures of the firm's environmental profile. We have a measure of the state environmental regulatory strictness using the Environmental Protection Agency from the US data. And then we have data on the bond and firm characteristics. So in terms of measuring the firm's climate risk exposure, we're going to use Sustainalytics environmental score. Sustainalytics is a rating agency that rates environmental, social, and governance activities and profiles of companies. And so we're going to use their score. And then we're also going to use just straight carbon emissions measures as shown by the CDP. Okay, so the Sustainalytics environmental score, and I should say Sustainalytics has since changed the way they do their ESG measures. So this is on an earlier type of measurement. But the score ranges that we're using, the score ranges from 1 to 100. They had 57 indicators and different industry weightings. The Sustainalytics uses a best of sector methodology to compare companies within a given sector to the industry best practices. And underlying each industry group template is a customized weight matrix designed to further highlight the key issues faced by each sector. So they are controlling for industry when they do this. And for their assessments, they had 4 dimensions. You know, how prepared is the company for environmental issues? How well did they disclose? What's their quantitative performance? And what's their qualitative performance? The CDP data is, so CDP is an organization that was formed for institutional investors in order to obtain data on companies' emissions. Companies voluntarily provide their data to the CDP. So we only use Scope 1 because that's the most reliable data. And so this is companies' measurements of their direct carbon emissions. And because not every company is included in CDP, because not every company voluntarily submits their emissions data, we're also going to use the top 15 carbon emissions industries as a measure so we can capture those companies that don't voluntarily provide their data. We also then measure straight emissions in tons at the firm level. And also at the firm level, we use a measure of the carbon emissions intensity. So this is the carbon emissions in tons divided by the firm's sales in thousands of dollars. So you won't be surprised by most of these top 15 emissions industries: electric, gas, and sanitary services, petroleum refining and related industries, oil and gas extraction, transportation by air, and then, manufacturing, railroad transportation. So again, we're going to use these top 15 emissions industries as a way to measure companies as a whole. So climate regulation in the United States, there are U.S. federal regulations, but they are enforced at the different states. So each of the different states has different enforcements. Texas versus California, you may find differences across we do find differences across the states. So we have this cross-sectional variation that allows us to see how important is the regulation process in the U.S. There's a compliance information system from which we gather our data. And we're going to look at 3 different laws: the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and looking for violations that the EPA finds according to the states. And again, this is the EPA. All the green is where the states are doing the enforcement. There are just a few states that the EPA does the enforcement. The rest of it is at the state level. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the total enforcements in the state and divide that by the total monitored facilities in the state. So we just have this proportional representation. But then what we're also going to do is look at the revenue that each company has in the different states and use that to get how much we should look at that state's enforcement for a company. So we have this measure we call regulatory stringency that is the proportional strictness of the different states according to the company's revenue in those states. We also have information on the bond characteristics, the credit ratings, and one thing that we're going to do about the credit ratings is we're going to take the lowest rating, and that's a 1, and the highest rating is a 22. And then, proportionally in between those. So as the ratings go up, that means they're higher ratings. We also are going to be able to get the yield spread, which we calculate as a company's monthly bond yield less the U.S. Treasury yield of the same maturity. So we have a yield spread for each bond, and we're gonna look at this. We have 2 different kinds of bonds or bond samples we're using. Some that are just issued, and then some that have been trading for a while, because we need that in order to measure how they traded before and after the Paris Agreement. Then we have firm characteristics, and then our sample period is 2009 to 2017. So just some sample statistics. The average credit rating at the issue level is about a Baa1, which is midway through the credit ratings, and the average time to maturity is about 10 years. When we look at traded bonds, we have a similar average credit rating, and then we have a trading spread of about 194 basis points. And again, we find that the average Sustainalytics environmental score is a 60. Remember, this is 1 out of 100. And the The one thing that was kind of strange is that our sample of bonds, 49% of the sample of bonds come from firms that are in the top 15 polluting industry, which you might think, wow, that's high. But if you think about it, you know, we have manufacturing firms, we have oil and gas firms, and those are the ones that are most likely to be issuing bonds. Okay, so our first test is, again, just to see, is there a relationship between a bond's credit rating or, in a separate analysis, its yield spread as a function of the firm's exposure to environmental regulatory risk, where we've determined this measure of regulatory risk by the firm's environmental profile. In other words, its Sustainalytics rating or its carbon measures, emission measures, and then the strictness of the firm's environmental regulation according to where they're located. So just to show you a real simple measure of our results, if we do a regression where we have credit rating as a dependent variable, so we want to see how does the environmental score of a firm affect their credit ratings, and then how does this interaction between the environmental score and the stringency, the regulatory stringency, affect their credit rating. And as you can see, when we use environmental score, the higher your environmental score, the higher your credit rating, which is what you would expect. And I've put down here all the different things we control for. So we control for many other aspects of the bond and the firm. We also find, if you take into account the environmental score and interact it with the regulatory stringency on the firm, we also find that the credit ratings are increasing in that. So if you have a higher environmental score and you're in a state with higher regulatory stringency, then your credit rating is going to be higher. When we look at emissions intensity, which, remember, is the level of emissions of a firm divided by the sales of the firm, so it takes into account the size of the firm, we find another intuitive result that the higher the emissions intensity for a firm, the lower the credit rating, and then the higher the emissions intensity of a firm interacted with, if there's more regulatory stringency, there's also a lower credit rating. When we look at this for yield spreads and we do the environmental score, and we should find the opposite for yield spreads and what we find for the credit ratings, we do find the opposite. The higher the environmental score, the lower the yield spread, the less you have to pay for your bonds if you have a higher environmental score. And again, if you have a higher environmental score and you're in a state with more regulatory stringency, then your yield spreads are also, you don't have to pay as much on your bonds. And when we look at admissions, the higher your admissions, the more you have, and this is everything else equal, the more you have to pay for your bonds because your bonds are riskier, as we saw from the credit ratings. And the higher the admissions interacted with, whether you're in states with more regulatory stringency, the more you have to pay for your bonds, again, because you face more regulatory risk. Okay, so these regression results provide support for our hypothesis that more regulation increases bond yield spreads for the low environmental profile issuer. Well, we may have some concerns about the endogeneity because maybe we have low environmental firms that are more profitable. Maybe high climate regulation states have stronger institutions. So what we need is a shock to regulations that's exogenous to the firm fundamentals. In other words, the firm fundamentals could not have caused this shock to the regulation. So we use the Paris Agreement shock, which the agreement occurred on December 12th, 2015. This is when 175 nations agreed, and after that, additional one, so it was a total of 197 nations agreed to strengthen the global response to climate change. The goal was to limit global temperature increases to below 2 degrees centigrade while pursuing efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So the implications of the Paris Agreement shock are that achieving the goals will require new regulations. That, and so for us, this setting is ideal for mitigating endogeneity and examining the impact of climate regulation on bond risk and pricing, because this agreement, as I said, is exogenous to firm fundamentals. So our hypothesis is that the Paris Agreement should negatively affect the outstanding bonds of issuers with poor environmental profiles. And it should be stronger if the firm is located in a stricter regulatory regime. So, one question you might ask was, well, was the December 12th, 2015 Paris Agreement really a shock? We believe it was. There was a November 1st headline that said, "Why Climate Treaty Will Be the Flop of the Year." And then on November 23rd, which is very close to this December 12th signing, the EU's climate and energy czar warned that an agreement was far from certain. Also, if we look at Google Trends for the topic Paris climate talks, you can see that the increase was again very close to the December 15th. If we look at November, it's still, there aren't very many people even looking up the topic Paris climate talks. So this suggests that the success of the talks was largely unanticipated. There's also a question, well, why would the Paris Agreement necessarily affect bond risk and pricing? And I just want to quote a Moody's managing director who said shortly after the Paris Agreement that the voluntary nature of a country's action makes more detailed assessment of the credit impact of the Paris Agreement difficult, although the trend is clear and broadly negative for those sectors with the highest exposure to carbon emissions regulation that we have identified. And then Moody's went further to talk about this. I just want to really point out the first one here, which is that policy and regulatory uncertainty regarding the pace and detail of emissions policies. So our belief is that this Paris Agreement led to more regulatory uncertainty, which would be heightened for the firms that have more carbon emissions or poorer environmental profiles. So I want to show you the preliminary analysis of changes in credit spreads and yield spreads in terms of around the Paris Agreement. The sample here is existing bonds that are traded. So if we look at the credit ratings for the top emission industries before and after the Paris Agreement, where blue is before and red is after, you can see, and if you just look at the one all the way on the left, the electric gas group, you can see that there was a drop in credit rating. If we just look at the average credit rating for this group, you can see this drop in credit rating around the Paris Agreement. And you see this for almost all of them. If you go over to, this is oil and gas extraction, you can see an even bigger drop. Or going over even more, metal and mining, again, you can see a big drop. But for almost all of them, you see a drop in the credit rating. So to me, this really shows in a very simple way how the Paris Agreement affected these firms. If we look at yield spreads, we find the opposite, which is what we should find is a credit rating drops, the yield spread should go up. And again, we find that around the Paris Agreement, you find that the credit rate, you find that the yield spreads went up after the credit rate, after the Paris Agreement, indicating that there would be more risk. And so higher yield would be required. We find the same kind of result when we use the environmental profile according to the Sustainalytics environmental score. And the worst ones, which are the ones over the left, have the biggest drop in credit ratings after the Paris Agreement. We also find that the spreads, and again, we find it's the worst ones that have the biggest increase after the Paris Agreement. And you might ask, well, why isn't there a number below 20 here? there were no scores that were environmental scores that were below 20. So 20 was the lowest. Okay, so then what we're interested in is if we can by comparing these firms to firms that weren't exposed to the Paris Agreement, do we find a difference in what happened after the Paris Agreement? So I'm going to run a regression where we're going to look at the rating and what we're most interested in is how the company's environmental profile after Paris affected their ratings. And we're going to use the different measures of environmental profile. So I think, a picture can just show you everything here. As you can see, this is the high emissions industry is how we measure the environmental profile. And this 0.0 is the Paris Agreement. So we're looking at the differences in the credit ratings between these on the left-hand side of the Paris Agreement. We're looking at the differences in the credit ratings between these firms and other firms prior to the Paris Agreement, and there is no significant difference. Once the Paris Agreement happens, these firms that were exposed have a significant decrease in their credit rating, and it lasts for a while. We find, so we have no pre-trend for those of you that are interested in the econometrics, but we find a significant drop in rating. We find the same thing if we use the environmental score, that again, there's no pre-trend, there's not a significant difference before the Paris Agreement, but then there's this big significant drop afterwards. And if you want to know the numbers, so this minus 0.58 is how much the credit rating dropped. And so we find no matter which measure we use for measuring the environmental profile of the firm, whether it's an environmental score, a high emissions industry, or having high emissions or high emissions intensity, we find that all of them have a negative effect. And the numbers tell us how much of the drop is. So the ratings drop about between 0.5 and 0.6 of notch for firms with poor environmental profiles relative to other firms at the same time. We do the same thing for yield spreads, and we find that when we look at the yield spreads, we have this significant increase in spreads. They do start going down, and we think that this is occurring here because there was another event that would have regulatory event that would have affected the yield spreads, but probably not the credit ratings. And no matter which profile. So what we find then, looking at the numbers, is yield spreads increase between 30 and 39 basis points for firms in high emissions industries relative to others. So then we do another difference in difference. If our results are due to climate regulatory risk, as we claim, then what we should find is that the results are driven by areas where environmental regulation is more strictly enforced. And we do find that the results on both ratings and yield spreads are largely concentrated in the high regulation states. So climate regulatory risk is a key driver for our results. Okay, so then a question is, well, what happens to the institutional bond ownership? Because for some bond owners that are institutions, they're going to be more worried about this long-term climate risk than may others. So we're going to look particularly at insurance companies and mutual funds and their ownership of these bonds. And what we find is, for the mutual funds, they perhaps have a shorter horizon on average. They're looking for the flows that are coming in monthly. For insurance companies, they have a long horizon. They're worried about what's going to happen to their returns over the long term. So we're going to use these, and we're going to measure what happens to the bond ownership. And I think what's important here is just seeing all these negative numbers, and they are significant, as the asterisks show. So what we find is that when we use the below median firm environmental score, the all institutions on average are selling out of these companies compared to other companies. We find, but the mutual funds are on average buying these bonds, and the insurance companies, which have a longer profile, are selling these bonds. So we also test for reversal after prospects for less strict climate regulation, because the political environment in the U.S. changed in 2016. So the U.S. signed the Paris Agreement in 2015. One of the presidential candidates during 2016 said that if he was elected president, the U.S. would pull out of the Paris Agreement. And so we're going to look at what happened around that election, given the Republican candidate's campaign promise to withdraw the U.S. from Paris Agreement, and he won. And then around June 1st, 2017, when the U.S. government officially announced that they would be withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. So if our hypotheses are correct, then we should see some kind of reversals in the effects of the Paris Agreement. So you know, you might ask, well, was the election of the Republican presidential candidate a surprise? And this is a betting market on whether that presidential candidate would win. And you can see that it was quite a surprise that it jumped up on the day after the election. So it was a surprise. There were also headlines. The Wall Street Journal headline, "Trump's surprise ends election, begins uncertainty for markets." CNN headline, "Trump's victory in U.S. elections, the latest in a year of shocks." So it appeared to have been a surprise. If we look at what happened to the yield spreads on bonds that had either low environmental score or that had high emissions, we find negative changes in their yield spreads. In other words, they didn't have to pay as much for their bonds after this election, and we argue that's because there was an expectation that they wouldn't be as subject to the regulatory risk that occurred from the Paris Agreement. Well, when it comes to withdrawal was not a shock, because many news reports were predicting the withdrawal prior to its happening. And the withdrawal was June 2017. And you can see that it was already weeks before. It was the expectations in the prediction market were going up that the U.S. would be withdrawing from the from the Paris Agreement. And so I think what's important here is to notice that when we look at what happened for firms with, again, the low environmental score or the high emissions, you can see that they all had increases in the yield spread after the announcement of the planned withdrawal. I'm sorry, they all had, this is not the yield spread. This is the credit ratings. They all had increases in the credit ratings after the announcement of the planned withdrawal. The yield spreads did not change. Again, what tends to happen is that the credit rating agencies tend to wait to make changes until they're pretty sure about what's going to happen. And given that there was some slight uncertainty, they didn't change the ratings until after the official announcement. On the other hand, the market changed the yield spreads once they had expectations of this happening upon the election of this president. And so that shows the spread. So in conclusion, we believe our results provide evidence that both corporate bond investors and rating agencies respond to climate regulatory risk, which is consistent with the survey views of institutional investors. Regulatory risk is an important channel through which climate risk can affect bond investors and credit rating agencies.
Thank you, Professor Stark. Do you hear me, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you for your talk. Our participants can type their questions into the chat box, but let me ask you a couple of questions myself. So you talked about the credit ratings and yield spreads. So and you also motivated your talk by talking about like institutional investors' motivation. So your studies from the investor's perspective, let's say, but there's the other side of the coin, right? The corporate manager's perspective. The reason I raise that up is, for example, credit ratings also determine some decisions that corporate managers make, like capital structure decisions and earnings management decisions can be dependent on the like whether you're in the brink of getting a investment grade rating or a speculative grade rating. So when we look at this question, this research question from the corporate manager's perspective in terms of greenwashing, like what kind of implications can we talk about, or maybe not specific to your study, but generally in the ESG literature, what is the general takeaway?
From my study for the implications for the corporate managers? Oh, I think it's that, you know, there are incentives for the corporate managers to change their environmental profile in order to get lower credit ratings. I just said that backwards. Lower yield spreads, higher credit ratings. And that's consistent with Sudhir Shava has a 2014 paper that looks at bank loans and found that the bank loans were related to firms' environmental scores. The higher the environmental scores, the less interest they had to pay on the bank loans.
Okay.
And I think you had another part of that question, which is the greenwashing.
Yeah, general literature, like where does it stand right now in terms of that?
I think that there would certainly be incentives for companies to engage in greenwashing, so that investors and customers think that they're environmentally friendly.
A second question is like there are regional differences, right, in the approach to the climate issues. So let's say between Europe and US, maybe we can say that Europe has a more stringent environment. First, would that be fair to say? And second, what would that imply with regards to your research question?
Okay, so I have a forthcoming AFA presidential address where I show this map that though those companies that have the highest environmental scores are in Europe. And you know, if you compare that to the US, there's a big difference. And I think it's because there's more of a social norm, and other studies have found this, but there's more of a social norm in Europe to be worried about environmental scores, about environmental activities of a company. And so I think companies are stricter on their own environmental practices in Europe versus the US. And given that, you would expect everything else equal, the European companies should, given our results, should have higher credit ratings and lower yield spreads, that they should have a lower cost of capital.
Thank you. Let me diverge from your paper and ask a more general research question about the ESG academic research. So, for example, you focus on bond yields and credit ratings. And there are many studies that also try to link climate risk or other aspects of ESG with equity returns. And there are many, maybe hundreds of studies, and they come up with mixed evidence. I think that would be the takeaway. So, like, it would seem like a very simple research question, but there's so many varying results. Why does that occur? I have a guess, maybe about the databases and etc. But how can we get more robust and results that everybody can agree on, more, let's say, convincing results?
I think part of it is the word that has become so big in finance these days, identification, and having different identification strategies. I guess we shouldn't be too surprised about these differences in results, and we get these differences in results on ESG performance as well, whether it's related to returns, and I think part of it is, this is somewhat of a new field, and so there's, and I guess luckily for finance researchers, there's no definitive right way to do it. And so until we can get enough studies and figure out what's going on, and do we have the right methodologies to capture this. I would also say, I think, like if you're looking at returns or yield spreads, to go back to this difference between value and values investors, if we can figure out a way to differentiate between those two types of investors, because they're going to affect the markets differently. And I think a lot of the research that we've done so far, has them all mixed together. So figuring out, which one is more dominant in certain markets, and this may be the case where looking at different markets might help in terms of differentiating these relationships.
Mm-hmm. I think another question from a practical perspective is the question of fiduciary duty. So, like the traditional idea was, okay, the fiduciary duty has to do with maximizing the value to the client. So ESG matters, should they come into the picture or not. But there's also the opposite idea, where ESG is fundamental to the financial results. So what's your take on that?
So again, I'm going to go back to this values versus value. I think if it's value investors, then the ESG is, by those investors, is considered to have a financial implication, to affect firms financially, and so for those investors, again, ESG is financially material. For the values investors, ESG is because of their preferences, and for some of them, they don't care whether it's financially material. There's lots of research showing that there are investors that are willing to pay to have higher, to have firms that do better in terms of the environment, their community, that are governed better. And so we don't necessarily expect to see a connection between performance and what's happening with the returns for those investors. And I think, to me, what's important about this is that if values investors want to give up return in order to invest according to their preferences, shouldn't we let them? They're Catholic value funds, they're Sharia value funds. People strongly believe that they want to invest according to their beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I have one final question. Again, that's a very general question. So, like, we're talking about this ESG research, but like most of the studies are on the E part, right? Including your study, the climate, the environmental part. Mm-hmm. So, like, why do you think the focus is on there, and is that a healthy focus?
Yeah. So I would say, so in finance, and accounting and management, we've been studying governance for years, right? Mm-hmm. So governance, there are many more studies on governance, and that's been going on for years. So I guess the key is between the environmental and the social. And I think the problem is, how do we measure social? I think people measure it differently. I also think that maybe on the social, focusing in on one kind of social measure, like Alex Edmonds has some papers on employee satisfaction, which is a social measure, and finds that employee satisfaction affects stock returns, and they find it around the world too in a recent paper that they have. So I think that the social, we're going to get more out of it if people pick certain parts of the social, just like people have in the environmental, people have started picking a lot of climate risk studies. Well, with the social, picking certain parts of the social, I think will result in some interesting results that we could find.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I said last question, but one more maybe, because you brought up Alex Edmonds. Like he was our guest actually before the pandemic. We were able to host him here in Istanbul, and I think he talked about the employee satisfaction paper at that time. Yeah. He recently had a paper called "The End of ESG," and where he says ESG is of course important because it's very critical to long-term value to investment, but it's also nothing special because it's just like any other intangible asset, like corporate culture or innovative capability. Like, what do you think about that?
I think he has some very good points in that paper. I think if you think about it, people have been looking at environmental issues for years. People have looked at different types of social issues like labor unions, like employee satisfaction. So I think treating them separately, there's no reason to have ESG altogether except for this report that was written in 2005 that was called "Who Cares Wins" by a group of financial institutions. And in that report, they coined the term ESG. And so it's become, I think, a shorthand since then to talk about sustainability. But I think, you could take each of the different issues separately and probably get further along than trying to lump them all together.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Professor Starks, for your engaging talk, and thanks to all our participants for joining our webinar, which was organized by Sabancı University's Center of Excellence in Finance under the sponsorship of Akbank. We will also share a subtitled version of this talk on our YouTube page. And in the meantime, I invite you to have a look at our past webinars and educational videos posted there. And we hope to see you in future events. And again, Professor Starks, thank you for sharing your time with us and giving us this talk.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Okay. Have a nice day and hope to see you.
Thanks.